Hello, my friends, and everyone interested in this ancient text called the Bible. We are pressing into Exodus chapter 25, where we're going to take a look at the Ark of the Covenant, the table of the showbread, and the OG menorah. Yeah, the candlestick, all of these within the sanctuary, what that even means, and we're going to have to wrestle with what do we do with the fact that some of these things look eerily similar to some of their Egyptian counterparts. Like, did Egypt have some of these things? Did Israel steal their idea from Egypt? Or did God genuinely give them this design that looks like something they've already known? And we're going to have to wrestle with what does that mean when it comes to God's revelation and the authenticity of the Bible. It's about to get very real. We might get a little bit colorful, so buckle up and welcome to Dumb Christian. So at the beginning of chapter 25, God kind of sets the stage and he says, okay, what I'd like you guys to do is call everybody in, and I would like everyone to free will contribute to the sanctuary. God's not compelling anybody to give, 10%. This isn't the tithe. This is, hey, we're going to make a tabernacle, which we're actually not going to get to till next time. But, and that's even like a mobile tent scenario. But he's talking also in this chapter about the furniture inside the tabernacle, the elements that are going to exist where the high priests are going to interact with these things. And they're going to be made out of gold and silver and goat skin. Actually, some of the original language says dolphin skin, which might actually mean more like a manatee from the nearby sea. There's a sea nearby that has some like dugongs or manatee or something, and it's like, oh, that might be what it's referring to. But it's some interesting stuff. If you actually look at the original language, sometimes it's translated goat skin or something like that. But all these elements, including like some rare metals, some rare gemstones, precious items, and some very, very rare colored, dyed fabrics and cloths, things that are very difficult to make. A lot of these elements are things that have already been used in pagan worship practices, like precious metals and rare colored dyes. And this is going to set the stage for the rest of what we're going to be talking about, because there's a couple of elements that God is going to instruct Moses to make that are like eerily similar to something they've already known and had to interact with in Egypt. But God's not compelling anybody. He doesn't say you have to contribute these things. He says, hey, let's just take a look and everyone just reflect on how generous God has been, and based on your own free will, I want you to just give. And this is actually going to stimulate a lot more of like an attitude of like, okay, well, there isn't like a bare minimum. It's, man, I just, out of the generosity of God's goodness, how do I want to respond to that? And so that's his invitation. There's this list. By the way, read it for yourself. Always read it for yourself. Reading it for yourself is going to be better than me trying to explain it. I'm just a dumb Christian. There's all these things: contribute, free will, but these are things that have already been used in even Egyptian worship practices. So what is happening here? And remember, God is not throwing out the entire system that already exists. He's interrupting the flow of culture that's already there. We talked about how God selected Abraham out of these nations ruled and worshiping other gods, but he didn't say, Abraham, you have to utterly dismantle your way of life and start fresh, go back to perfection, go back to Eden. Although there is kind of like this flavor of God looking for a way to reset his presence with people so he can dwell among the human beings in his family. And that's kind of the idea here of what he's trying to establish is a tabernacle, a sanctuary, which literally translates a sacred space. And we talked a little bit about that before, where God is trying to create this new sacred space where he can dwell among his family. But he's not requiring that they just throw everything out. And so that's the kind of the framework that I want to start with, is to help us understand that what God is doing here is he's taking what they're already familiar with, the things that they've already interacted with when it comes to royalty and the gods and the systems of worship, not in every essence. We're actually going to discover some ways that God wants to interact with Israel that are wholly other and unique and different to any other. But there are some things that are very similar, like the Ark of the Covenant. And this is highly debated because there's a large, portion of the Jewish community and Jewish scholars that are advocating, no, this is unique among ancient East, and there was nothing like this ever, and because this was holy, right? This was God's, it's translated mercy seat, which we'll get into, but this was like God's presence. This is the place where you go to meet God, and it has to be completely different. And I think a lot of times we think about that when we read the Bible. Well, shouldn't this be radically different from everything else? But God regularly and repeatedly meets people where they are at and starts with what they're familiar with. And he says, let's take the things that you're familiar with. Let's start to remold those and reform those so that we see them differently, especially when it comes to the way they see the gods. These are things that are used to interact with and worship the gods. So Yahweh God is saying, okay, let's take your perspectives and let's reorient them so that you don't fall back into this thing. Because if God were to take something and create something so radically different and didn't look anything else like, the other worship practices, it'd be very easy to be like, okay, well, this is God's type of worship, and these are the lower, the inferior gods, the spiritual beings in rebellion against God. But Yahweh God is trying to reclaim and redeem for himself the worship of God, and it's been perverted and twisted to be used for these spiritual beings in rebellion. And he's saying, let's actually use this in the correct way. Let me show you how to do this properly. And so we're taking those things and reorienting them to fit Yahweh God's design. And the book of Hebrews in the New Testament says that the tabernacle, the temple, the ark, all of these elements are actually like shadowy glimpses into what it's like in heaven. They're kind of like blurry pictures. So there's something about these elements that are supposed to resemble and reflect worship of Yahweh God in heaven. And the idea is they've been taken, twisted, and perverted, used by the spiritual beings in rebellion against God for their own ends. And God's saying, let's reclaim this. Let's restore this to what it was intentionally, originally supposed to be. Okay, so the Ark of the Covenant, not Noah's Ark. This is actually a completely different Hebrew word to talk about it, but it's still like the same kind of idea, right? Like this protective box that transports something important, like Noah's Ark, right? Giant, big floating box transporting important things, but it's a very different word for a very different purpose. However, because the way that, especially in Egypt, so there are lots of ancient Eastern religions that utilized similar boxes covered in gold for religious worship and purposes, but it's especially similar to the ones used in Egypt, and they were often used in conjunction with being placed on a boat. And so then some scholars, especially critics, just kind of tie it back to Noah's Ark, and they say, well, you're just stealing, you're just recycling the stories or whatever. But this is actually a very different word, very different concept that God is going to unveil here. And so God says to Moses, here are the instructions. I want you to build an ark. I want you to build it out of acacia wood. This is wood that is, it's a very small trunk. It's hard to harvest. It's very hard wood. It's very durable, so it's going to last a long time, but it's a very difficult resource to harvest and then to mold and shape. And so God's like, take this wood. In fact, the word here for acacia wood is actually an Egyptian word. So there's that confusing similarity. Like, okay, well, already right off the bat, it looks like they're just stealing ideas from Egypt. So I want you to take this box, make it out of acacia wood, cover it on the outside and on the inside with gold. And then you're going to put rings around it so that a bar can slide through the ring so that you can carry the ark without actually touching it. This is going to be important much later. You'll have to get into like the kings and the judges and all that stuff where the ark is like, you can't touch the ark. Then we get into the lid, which is just pure gold. There's no wood in it. The lid is made of pure gold. And on top of it are two cherubim. And that's going to be interesting. We'll have to come back to that in a little bit. Now, the lid is referred to as the mercy seat. For some reason, it gets translated mercy seat, but the original Hebrew language, literally just means the lid of the object. So that's the dynamic. Here, that's the picture. It's this gold box, like 2.5 cubits by 1.5 cubit by 1.5 cubit. And we'll also get into the measurements here in a little bit. And so what do we do with this box? Well, what's going to be kept in the box is the 2 tablets of the 10 words or the 10 commandments that we've already talked about. They will be kept in the ark. Sometimes people, and I think for myself too, like we think, oh, and the jar of manna and Aaron's staff. But if we actually dig into it and find out the language where it says, take the omer of manna, place it in the presence of or in front of the Ark of the Testimony, or Aaron's staff, in front of, almost like to be displayed for people to see. Because also remember, the instructions were to take the omer so that people remember. They can look at this and remember, so it's not hidden away. But the wording later in the Bible does not say that the omer and the staff were in the Ark of the Covenant. It says they were placed among it, like in front of it, to be visible and to be displayed. Okay. So in Egypt, there are regularly used these large boxes covered in gold with a gold lid, and even sometimes there have been some pharaohs like Tut, King Tut, Pharaoh Tut, and he is portrayed with these like divine guardians protecting his resting area, his divine sacred space. And that's what these cherubim are actually supposed to be. They're supposed to be like these divine guardians protecting a sacred space. Remember, there's something really sacred about this box that God wants to teach Israel. And so there's this like eerily similar theme of, well, hang on, they already have this thing in Egypt. Are they just copying something they've seen in Egypt, or is God really giving them instructions to remake something they've already seen in Egypt? Now, remember, God is taking something they're familiar with to correct their perspective on it. And the Egyptian use of this, look, they would carry it with bars, but they would usually put it on a boat. And a boat is on water. We talked about this earlier in Exodus. Water is chaos. The gods are over chaos and all this kind of stuff. But the box itself was either used to house a god, to be like its home, this really beautiful, ornate, sacred space where the god could live, or it was used to transport the god, from one area of the lands to another, or into battle, or whatever. Again, in some similar ways that we see the Ark of the Covenant being used. However, there are some key differences, and this is, again, how God kind of operates in the familiar. He says, let's take what you're familiar with, and let me show you a better perspective on it. The Ark of the Covenant is not God's home. It is actually his footstool. It's where he rests his feet when he comes to speak with Moses, when he interacts with the high priests, when he is present. That's his footstool. It's not his abode. It's not his dwelling place. What he wants to do is create a tabernacle, which is his own like personal tent, but that's not even where that doesn't even restrict him to an area. That just gives him a kind of like a protective housing for the furniture that we're going to continue to talk about, the ark, the table, and the candlestick. Not only is the ark not God's like limited home where he lives, it's also often mistook or misunderstood to be like the God's presence himself. And you have to appease God by the way you interact with the ark or how you take it somewhere, how you treat it. What it's meant to be is a physical reminder, like when it is taken into battle or when it's transported, when it's time to move camp and the ark leads. It's meant to be this visual reminder of God's presence, his direction, his power, his provision, and that he is with Israel. But remember, he said, no carved images. We're not going to make a visual representation of God. That's out of the question. So this, again, has nothing to do with who God is, what he looks like, or how he functions. It's a representation of the fact that he is present in Israel. This is very different from the Egyptian use of these types of boxes. They were the gods' homes. And sometimes when we read the Bible and we look at the ark and its uses, it's brought into a river and the river parts so that they can walk through the ark. This is later, I think, in Joshua, or walk through the river. And sometimes it's brought into battle and it brings victory. And so sometimes it's looked at as this like supernatural weapon or this divine power that's being wielded by the people of Israel. But that's just not the case. It's the place where God meets people. It's not a guarantee that God is sitting on the box at any given moment. He's not a genie that you can come to the box and, oh, great Ark of the Covenant that God made with us, hear me. No, this is where God meets people. He doesn't exist in the box. No scripture ever says that God speaks from the box or from inside, out of the box. It says from above the box, from the lid of the ark. That's where he meets people. Jewish tradition is going to talk about the half measurements. So 2.5 cubits, 1.5 cubit, 1.5 cubit. Why isn't God using whole cubit measurements? And there's a rabbi in the 16th century who had this insight, and he says, the Lord called for the broken measurements. So he calls the 2.5 cubits a broken measurement, the 1.5 cubit a broken measurement, because it's not a whole measurement. And he said, well, these are the measurements of the ark, which contain all of the tablets, the original 2 that Moses broke, which are later in Exodus, and then the full stones that are still complete, which are even further later in Exodus, but all 4 of those stones are placed in the ark. And it's meant to remind the people who are striving to cultivate the 10 words or the 10 commandments in their own lives that they too should be broken measurements. That it is God's reminder that the 10 words, the 10 commandments, which are like the instructions for perfection, are something that we can't achieve, we can't attain. And so it's this visual reminder to also be humble and broken as you strive to contain and embody the 10 words, the 10 commandments that God has given his people. And so maybe that's a too bit of a broad and generic stroke over what the Ark of the Covenant is. The chapter 25 here just gives like a lot of measurements and some instructions on the cherubim that go on top. By the way, the word cherubim is a Babylonian word, like an Akkadian word, which doesn't even like exist in the Jewish language until much later when they're in exile, like 400, 500 years before Jesus shows up on the scene. So this is another one of those like instances where it's like, well, either they had like some weird word that wasn't a part of their language that God supernaturally gave them, which is possible, or what's very likely is, again, while they were in Babylon and they were trying to like understand how do we interact with these instructions, this law, this God, when we can't be at the temple. We've talked about this before. how do we interact with it? How do we relate to it? And so there was some like editing done to help make it more palatable, more understandable, more relatable to the exiles in Babylon. And they're there where they're learning Babylonian and Akkadian, and this is a word, cherubim, from that culture used to help them understand what was originally going on when God gave instructions for the place where he would meet people, the ark, on the lid of the ark. Then we get a table of showbread. This is also something that we're going to have to wrestle with, because there were tons of pagan religions and cultures where they would have a table set out for their gods, where they would offer on their gods just a full offer for their gods, a full-blown meal, bread and roasted meat, boiled meat, wine, and just like a smorgasbord. And they would regularly do this every day as a kind of way of appeasing the gods, indulging the gods, sustaining the gods, like here's your gift of food. So what is happening here when God says, I want you to also create for me a table where you're going to keep showbread? Shewbread. I'm not sure what the bread. Let's just bread. Again, there are similarities, but actually its use and purpose is dramatically different from the other cultures that use this kind of thing. Like I said, in the other cultures, it's a buffet, it's a gorge and binge for the gods. But for this, it's just a place where you keep the empty vessels, where you used these vessels in the sacrifice. But while they're on the table, they're empty, except for some bread. And the difference here is that this bread is only replenished every week, once a week. And that is connected with Sabbath, God's kind of rest. And it actually comes much later, I think in Leviticus, with instructions that the priests can eat the bread, because nobody's supposed to be doing work on the Sabbath, right? And so this is actually like an extra gift that God is saying, hey, let's put some extra stuff in here so that while the priests are working, they can actually eat at God's table while they're enjoying God's kind of rest. And he is inviting the priests to eat with him. Not that he's eating from the table, because he eats, I don't know, whatever God eats, in heaven. But he's inviting hey, come to my table and eat at my table. And in the New Testament, believers in Jesus Christ are called, given the right to be sons of God. So they are included in this. Priests, a kingdom of priests, they're part of this. We're not talking like Christians replace Israel. They're two very different things, but they are also priests invited to eat at the table of God. And that sounds very familiar to communion. Yeah, I'll just throw that in there for free, for whatever it's worth. Then we get to the candle. And this is pretty interesting, because the candle, or the original menorah, is actually extremely unique in its design and its function. So the ark has some similar designs and uses in other cultures. The table for the bread has some similar, pagan practices and worship uses. But the candle is very, very different. And there are actually some who try really hard to make some arguments that say, oh, no, it's very similar to some pagan things like there's a tree of life statue in the ancient East, or hallway decorations that someone might see as they walk through a god's temple, reaching the altar or whatever. But this is very different. And there's so many differences in the way that the candle is constructed. Its structure is radically different from any of the Tree of Life archaeology finds, and its design, its decorations are dramatically different from any of the hallway decorations that might have been seen as people walked, to get close to the god, whichever god they were serving and worshiping. But this candle is unique And Exodus here says that the purpose of the candle is to provide light for the work being done in the presence of God, which is a beautiful callback, a unique and wholly other callback to the very first day of creation. What did God create first? Light. So the menorah is the light provided for those who are participating in the ongoing work of God's creation and the work that he has for them, which is now a little bit different. And the Jewish tradition is that the menorah is the symbol of God in the presence of the work that they're doing, because God is light, right? So that's his presence while they work. And ultimately, these pieces of basically furniture are elements to draw attention to Yahweh and off of the other gods as they operate in the work of Yahweh God. These things that maybe they're kind of familiar with, and God's saying, no, this is the way I want you to correctly understand interacting with me. Let's take these things that you're already familiar with and let's correct them. Let's adjust them and orient them correctly. The ark is God's footstool, not his house, but it is where he meets the people in his tabernacle, which is basically like a mobile tent. And we will get into that next time. Hey, if you've enjoyed this content, please check out my sources below. I'm sure they would appreciate it. Subscribe, like, share this with your friends and family so we don't go on this journey alone. I am working on a gospel project, which is taking up a lot of my time and energy. So if just be expecting, maybe a week break in here somewhere, and I'll do my best to give you guys a heads up before it happens. But until then, I'll see you in the next one. I love you guys.